Ever feel like, you know those images we have of knights and castles, the whole medieval thing, like it's more fantasy than actual history?
Yeah, it's funny how those romanticized pictures stick with us.
Right, like we talk about the Dark Ages, but
And that term itself is a problem. Dan Jones, he really dives into this. Like, are we really getting the full picture?
well, when you say Dark Ages, I immediately think, lack of progress, backwardness.
And that's exactly the kind of thinking Jones challenges. So this label, it gets slapped on the early Middle Ages, right? Like 500 to 900 AD. And yeah, there are fewer written records from that time, at least in Western Europe.
So like our view is kind of skewed from the start.
Exactly. We're missing pieces of the puzzle. Plus, we got to remember it's mostly a Western European perspective.
Right.
There's a whole world beyond that. So to call it Dark Ages, it's, well, kind of oversimplifying things.
Makes you wonder what other historical truths we just accept without, really digging deeper.
All the time. History's constantly being reinterpreted, new discoveries pop up, and boom, our whole understanding shifts.
Which reminds me, all those medieval legends, King Arthur, Robin Hood, were those guys even real?
Ah, the million-dollar question. So, concrete proof for King Arthur, like in the stories, nope. But those stories themselves, they tell us a lot about the time they came from.
It's like myths and legends. They reveal more about the storytellers than the actual history, maybe.
Exactly. Think about it. Those Arthurian legends blew up in the 12th century, right when knighthood was becoming a thing. It's almost like the stories, they were a blueprint for this new warrior class.
So even if there wasn't a literal King Arthur, the ideals he represented, that had an impact.
Absolutely. It's kind of wild how fiction can shape reality.
And speaking of blurring the lines between legend and reality, Dan Jones talks about this real-life knight, William Marshall. His biography is like an adventure novel. He served multiple kings, crazy loyal, even survived being a hostage as a kid.
Yeah, his life story is incredible. From almost being launched from a trebuchet as a child to becoming one of the most respected knights in England.
Wait, hold on. Launched from a trebuchet as a kid.
I know, right? Sounds crazy. So his bio says his dad was defending a castle against King Stephen, and they had young William as hostage. King Stephen, to, pressure his dad, threatened to launch him if they didn't surrender.
Talk about hardcore negotiation tactics.
No kidding. It shows you just how brutal medieval warfare was, but also how important quick thinking was. So somehow, young William charms King Stephen, makes him laugh, saves his own neck. Now, the story might be embellished, over time, but it definitely paints a picture, right? The dangers, the crazy twists of fate. It was a wild time.
So much for the romantic image of knighthood, huh?
Yep.
So this William Marshall, he went on to have quite the career after, dodging that trebuchet.
Oh, yeah. He rose through the ranks, became known for his skills in battle, his unwavering loyalty. He was also a big deal in those tournaments, which, by the way, were way more intense than what you see in the movies.
Yeah, when I think jousting, it's all fancy costumes, choreographed moves.
Not quite. That stage stuff came later in the 12th century. It was rough. Imagine huge open fields, knights decked out in armor charging at each other, with lances, blunted of course. The goal, knock your opponent off their horse, maybe even capture them for ransom. Dan Jones compares it to a mix of polo, Formula One racing, and rugby.
Sounds more like a survival competition than a sport.
Yeah. There was definitely skill involved, but also a lot of danger. It was high stakes, for sure. You could end up seriously hurt or worse.
Speaking of things meant to withstand a beating, let's talk castles. What's the real deal with those things?
Right. Castles, they kind of went through their own evolution, just like knighthood. The early ones, the ones the Normans built after conquering England, they were pretty basic. Imagine a wooden tower, a keep on top of this big mound of earth, the motte. Around it, you'd have courtyard, the bailey, usually protected by a wooden fence. So these motte and bailey castles, they worked, but they weren't the giant stone fortresses we usually think of.
So how did we get from those early castles to, the massive ones we see in movies?
King Edward the First. He comes along in the late 13th century. Ambitious guy, wanted to conquer Wales, Scotland, the whole deal. And to show who's boss, he goes on this huge castle building spree.
So it was more about, projecting power than actual defense.
Absolutely. Edward's castles, especially the ones in Wales, super intimidating. Massive stone walls, crazy defenses, even fancy living quarters. These things were a statement like, England's in charge, Get used to it.
Yeah, I'm picturing like Caernarfon Castle in North Wales. It's
Oh,
amazing. It must have taken forever to build those things.
Oh, tons of resources, manpower, the works. And get this, Edward brought in this master architect, Master James of St. George. He was inspired by the fortifications he'd seen in Constantinople, brought a whole new level of sophistication to English castle design. These weren't just fortresses, they were architectural masterpieces.
It's mind-blowing, like how they built these things without, modern technology.
It really shows you how skilled those medieval architects and builders were.
But did castles always stay purely military? Did their purpose, change over time?
Great question. They definitely evolved. They became palaces, prisons, administrative hubs, even housed menageries.
Oh, what now?
Menageries, like zoos. They'd keep exotic animals to show off how rich and powerful they were. The Tower of London, perfect example of how castles changed. It was a royal residence, a treasury, a prison, and yeah, even had a menagerie at one point.
So they started as fortresses but became like multi-purpose centers.
It shows how medieval society's needs changed, right? What started as a symbol of conquest could become, well, all sorts of things. A symbol of the crown, a place of power, you name it. We'll get more into this when we come back.
Sounds like we're just getting started with castles. Stick with us as we dive deeper into knights, castles, and more. Welcome back to our medieval deep dive. We've been hanging out with knights, touring castles, but now let's zoom out a bit. What about the everyday folks? The people who weren't, fighting battles or living in those fancy castles?
It's easy to get lost in the big stories, right? The kings, the conquests. But most people in the Middle Ages, they weren't royalty or warriors.
Right. So like farmers, artisans, merchants.
Exactly. Those were the folks keeping things running.
So paint me a picture. What was life actually like for them? Was it all like endless toil and misery?
Well, life was definitely tough. I mean, most people worked the land. Their whole lives revolved around the seasons, what their lord demanded. There wasn't a lot of, social mobility.
So you were kind of stuck in the class you were born into.
Pretty much. But that doesn't mean it was all doom and gloom. People found ways to, have fun, celebrate.
I'm picturing holidays like Christmas, Easter. Were those big deals back then?
Huge. Festivals and holidays were a big deal. A chance to break from the routine, the whole community coming together. Feasts, music, dancing, games. It was a real party atmosphere.
It's kind of nice to imagine, a break from the daily grind.
Totally. And it wasn't just the big holidays. People found joy in, simpler stuff, too. Storytelling, singing, playing games. Taverns were popular spots. A chance to hang out, escape the pressure,
Yeah, I can picture those taverns. Rowdy, full of life.
Exactly. And we can't forget religion, right? The church wasn't just about spiritual stuff. It provided social support, a sense of community.
So even though life was tough, they found ways to connect, find meaning. It's pretty inspiring, actually.
It is. People are resilient, right? They find a way. And those stories, the everyday folks, they're a big part of understanding the Middle Ages, even if they don't always make it into the history books.
We often think of everyone fitting into these neat little boxes, right? Knights, peasants, clergy. But what about women? Were they all just stuck in the home? Or were there some who, broke the mold?
It's more complicated than that, just like today, right? Women's lives back then were diverse. Yeah, society often put them in secondary roles. Limited legal rights, not much access to education. But that doesn't mean they weren't important.
So while they faced limitations, they still played key roles.
Absolutely. They ran households, raised kids, worked alongside their husbands. They were vital to, the whole fabric of society. And some women, they totally defied expectations. They made their mark on history.
You're talking about like Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Exactly. She was Queen of France, then Queen of England. Super savvy politically, patron of the arts. And then there's Hildegard of Bingen, this amazing abbess, composer, writer, visionary. Huge influence in religious and intellectual circles.
So even in a patriarchal society, some women rose to the top.
Yep. And their stories remind us that women have always been shaping history, even if they don't always get the credit.
It's about looking beyond the usual stories to find those hidden figures.
Exactly. History's not just about kings and battles. It's about everyone who lived through it. Their struggles, their triumphs, big and small.
Okay, so we've talked about knights, castles, daily life, the roles of women. But there's this one thing we can't ignore. It kind of looms over the whole era, the Black Death.
Yeah, that was more than just a disease. It reshaped the medieval world.
So the Black Death, this was the bubonic plague, right?
One of the deadliest pandemics in history. Think about it. 1/3, maybe even half of Europe's population wiped out. It's hard to even grasp how much suffering there was.
Must have felt like the apocalypse. So what happened after, like in the immediate aftermath?
It was chaos. Mass death, fear, social upheaval. Entire communities gone. Economies shattered. The whole social order shaken to its core. People were looking for answers, for someone to blame.
Yeah, I can imagine. It must have been terrifying.
Absolutely. But even in all that darkness, there were acts of kindness, resilience, people taking care of the sick, burying the dead, trying to make sense of it all.
It's strange to think about. Such a horrible event, but also people coming together.
That's humanity, right? Even in the worst times, there's always that spark of hope.
Did the Black Death, like, change the course of history? Beyond just the immediate devastation?
Oh, definitely. The massive death toll, it led to labor shortages, which actually gave peasants more bargaining power. It kind of contributed to the decline of feudalism. And, after the plague, there were all these religious and social reforms. People were wrestling with the big questions, life, death, meaning.
So the Black Death, as horrible as it was, it kind of pushed things forward.
It was a turning point, for sure. A period of massive change. It set the stage for the Renaissance, the early modern era.
It's kind of mind-blowing, that something so devastating could also be a catalyst for change.
That's history for you. It's full of those paradoxes. Tragedy and progress, destruction and renewal, they're all tangled up.
It makes you think about how we respond to challenges today, right? I mean, look at the resilience people showed back then.
It's a powerful reminder, for sure. We have this incredible capacity for hope and innovation, even when things are really tough.
Join us for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore how the Middle Ages still echo in the world today. Back again for our final look at the Middle Ages. We've gone from myths to plagues, and now the big question. What's the lasting impact? Like, how did this era, the one everyone calls the Dark Ages, how did it actually shape us?
It's pretty amazing when you think about it. So much of what we see as modern has its roots back then. Architecture, legal systems, even our ideas about, heroes and love. It's everywhere.
Okay, but give me some concrete examples. I'm having trouble connecting knights and castles to, life in the 21st century.
All right, we'll start with those incredible Gothic cathedrals all over Europe. Those soaring arches, the stained glass, it's all a testament to the artistry and the spiritual side of the Middle Ages. Or think about the Magna Carta. That came out of this power struggle between King John and his barons back in 1215.
Yeah, the Magna Carta rings a bell.
Yeah.
Something about limiting the king's power.
Exactly. It established this idea that even the king, he's got to follow the law. And that idea, it didn't just stay in England. It spread, influenced revolutions, constitutions, even our own.
So those medieval ideas about, individual rights, they're still relevant.
Absolutely. The Magna Carta was a huge deal for constitutional law, protecting individual rights. It's still a cornerstone.
And what about literature? We always hear about King Arthur, Robin Hood, but was there more to it than just those stories?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The Middle Ages saw this shift from Latin to more everyday languages. Think Chaucer writing in Middle English or Dante in Italian. They paved the way for all the great literature that came after.
So they weren't just telling stories, they were changing how we tell stories.
Exactly. And those knightly tales, even if they're simple, they had this huge impact. Our ideas of heroism, romantic love, striving for something noble, it all comes from there. You see it in books, movies, even video games.
Funny how those old stories still speak to us, huh?
That's the magic of stories, right? They connect us across time. We're all human, dealing with the same stuff.
It really makes you realize how much we owe to the Middle Ages. But what about, technology, scholarship? Was there progress, or was it really a dark age in those areas?
People always assume the Middle Ages were just stagnant, but that's not true at all. There were some big advancements, even if things moved a bit slower. The printing press, eyeglasses, Arabic numerals, those were all game changers. They spread knowledge, and that led to, everything we have today.
So those medieval inventors, they were kind of setting the stage for the scientific revolution.
Yeah, in a way. They were pushing boundaries, exploring new ideas, challenging the old ways. Universities popped up, became these hubs of learning, debating, preserving ancient texts. It all fed into the Renaissance later on.
It's a good reminder that progress isn't always a sudden thing, right? It builds on what came before.
Exactly. History's like a tapestry, all these threads woven together. To understand where we are, we got to look back at all those threads, even the ones that seem far away.
So as we wrap up our Middle Ages adventure, what are the big takeaways? What do you hope folks remember?
Well, first, I hope they see how complex and diverse the Middle Ages really were. It wasn't just one thing. It was change, upheaval, darkness, and light all mixed together.
It definitely blows that whole Dark Ages label out of the water.
For sure. And second, I hope they see how much influence this era still has. It's all around us, from art and architecture to, our legal systems and even our values. The Middle Ages weren't just some prelude to the modern world, they helped create it.
It's like those echoes from the past are still shaping us today.
And lastly, I hope this deep dive makes people curious. I hope they want to learn more, dig deeper into this amazing and often misunderstood period of history.
That's what the deep dive is all about. We want to get you exploring thinking for yourself.
So as we say goodbye to the Middle Ages, I want to leave you with a question. What parts of this era really stood out to you? What lessons can we take from it, the good and the bad? How can we apply those lessons to, the world we live in today?
Thanks for joining us on this journey through the Middle Ages. We had a blast. Don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations of history, science, culture, all that good stuff. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those big questions.